Well, I want to welcome everyone here today. Welcome to Intersection, where faith and practice, where theology and practice meet. Randy Harris and I are co-hosting this event. It's a time and a place for us to work on and reflect on timely and substantive topics as we draw wisdom and insight from guests that we have with us. This is Intersection number 11. It's titled Faith, Truth, and Fake News. And we've got a couple of special guests with us today. I'm going to see if we can get them on our screen here. There comes one and two. Great. We want to welcome Cheryl Mann Bacon and Bobby Ross Jr. with us today as our special guests. Cheryl is a writer, a journalist, an editor, and she's doing all that after a long and distinguished career as the chair of the Department of Journalism here at Abilene Christian University. And full disclosure, we're delighted to have her also act as a consultant within the Siburt Institute, working with congregations as they think about communication and the work, the hard and good work of communication in congregations. And Bobby, it's a delight to have you with us. Bobby is the editor-in-chief of the Christian Chronicle, and he's been with the Chronicle for 15, 16 years. Before that, a writer, a journalist for the Oklahoman, which takes me back to my childhood reading that paper as a person growing up in Oklahoma, and was a writer for the Associated Press as well. He also has a weekly national piece that's published in Religion Unplugged as he looks at religion in the news. So it's a delight to have both of you, Bobby and Cheryl. Thanks for joining us today. We're engaged today in a conversation about the politicization, the polarization that's occurring as we have conversations with one another with the news and with the way in which media plays itself out. But before we get into all of that today, just a few logistical matters. For those of you joining us, please give us a shout out in the chat. Let us know where you're tuning in from. And as we engage in the conversation today, we invite you to ask some questions, and we'll utilize your questions to guide our conversation today in the second half of our hour. You can ask your questions in the Q&A section, the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Use chat at the bottom of your screen to say hello to each other and to speak to the community that's being formed here today via Zoom. Well, before I ask Randy to set the stage for our conversation today, I'd like to take a minute for us to gather in prayer. We believe that as brothers and sisters, that wherever we gather, even in this digital space, that God is present, and we want to invite him to be a part of our conversation today. Would you bow and let's take a moment of silence for prayer. Eternal presence, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, hear our prayers and use this time today together to form us and shape us for your kingdom's sake. Amen. Well, Randy, you and I spent a lot of time talking to church leaders and ministers, and one of the things that always pops up that's present in our congregations today is just how politically charged things are. If it's not on the surface, it's just below the surface. So what makes having a conversation about being literate news consumers matters here today? Set the stage for us.
Yeah, I have a real newspaper here. I always start my day by reading the newspaper, basically for local news. I want to know what's going on with my friends and neighbors. And I live in a small town, so I often see something about somebody I know. But many of our listeners will know that the most influential theologian of the 20th century, Karl Barth, famously said, you should preach with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. And the Bible tells you what you preach, and the newspaper tells you how. And when you think about it, there's two ways that can go wrong. You could use the newspaper to tell you what to preach, which would be a bad idea because that would make you faddish. Or you could throw away the newspaper completely and you could become completely irrelevant, even though you're trying to preach gospel. You're not aiming it in a place where anybody can hear it or connect with it. So it's really quite the task to hold the Bible and the newspaper together in that what and how. And we used to think the hard part was interpreting the Bible, but now we've decided the hard part is interpreting the newspaper. And so I'm hoping Bobby and Cheryl can help us a little bit with that. And that's still a pretty good model for preaching.
It is. It is. I still love that essay from Karl Barth. So let's just start, Bobby and Cheryl, as we enter into this, talk about a newspaper. Karl Barth's writing in 1909 or something, and long before CBS or NBC or any kind of other kinds of media, it was the newspaper was the primary conveyor of news. We live in a very different kind of world today, and so sometimes we talk about media, right? News media. That's kind of a broad thing. So Cheryl, let me just start with you. When we say media, or we talk about news media, what are we really talking about? Let's get some things kind of anchored on the ground here.
Well, I think that when we talk about media, it's really important to realize that media is a very broad term. It includes all sorts of different methods of getting information out: television, newspapers, different kinds of digital platforms. Mm-hmm. It also includes different avenues of speaking: opinion, entertainment, and news content or information are the three that are most prominent. Earlier you mentioned news analysis, and that's a part of that news piece. Mm-hmm. So learning to distinguish between those 3 or 4 categories is a really important place to start, because we're really not, entertainment and opinion are both entirely legitimate uses of the space, but they're not news. And so if we're going to talk about news, then let's focus on people who are gathering information and sharing information with an audience.
Well, it seems to me, Bobby, that oftentimes what is happening is that we get entertainment and news, or maybe opinion and news sort of conflated. Am I reading that right? Talk to us a little more about that.
Yeah, I think you are reading that right. And I think and maybe I'm just being nostalgic, thinking maybe maybe the world was better and people had a more common set of facts back when more people were like Randy and getting a newspaper every morning, because now people are getting their information from all those sources that Cheryl just described. And some of those sources of information are good and some of them are not. And so it's kind of created a lot of issues just because we don't have a common set of facts like we used to have when everybody got the same newspaper, and then we could kind of all have opinions on the same facts. And now we don't even have the same facts, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So not only is I'm trying to get a sense of the complexity of all this. So it's not just that we have multiple sources for our news. I'm just thinking very few of us actually read a print newspaper. Randy is, I think, an anomaly. I don't know. I mean, I read the newspaper, but it's in a digital form. But there's so many forms of media and that we've sort of hinted at, and then this diversity of what media is and the confusion that occurs in all of that. That confusion often gets us arguing about something that isn't really news at all. It seems to me. How do we begin to probe deeper into that. Talk to me about how to be able to tell when you have a really good news piece versus an opinion piece, or something that might be, Cheryl, you're come out of the academic environment where we might call it entertainment, even though it might not be entertaining. It's actually inhabiting a different kind of space. How do we distinguish those categories, and how do we begin to say, no, this is really attempting to give us the news, or is delivering facts to us?
I think one of the places you begin is by looking at the source. Is it a newspaper, or is it a news program, a news network? And then within that source, that big broad source, what part of their information sharing does it occupy? We used to understand that when we opened that hard copy newspaper, there was going to be a page that said opinion or editorials. And in theory, people knew that's the opinion. Now, I will say, it's not unusual for people to say, it's not your place to share your opinion. Well, yeah, sharing opinions on editorial pages and in opinion pieces has been around as long as newspapers have been around. And in fact, we tend to idealize the old days of the newspaper business. But if you go back far enough, those news pieces were blatantly opinionated. You get back to the Federalist papers.
Yeah,
that was a part of news media at that time, and for another 100 years and more, news itself was extremely opinionated and didn't try to hide that. As journalism became an academic subject, a higher level of expectations came along. But so first of all, what kind of source is it? Is it supposed to be a news source, or is it supposed to be entertainment? Stephen Colbert is an entertainer. He talks about subjects in the news, but he is an entertainer. So let's not slam all of news media because of something Colbert says.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's the place to start.
Yeah. So Bobby, so sources. So talk a little more about how would I, what am I looking for if I'm looking at a piece and I'm trying to judge, is this a reliable source, or are they using reliable sources? What else would I be looking for?
Yeah, I think you would be looking to see, does this article cite does it attribute the information? Is it just somebody's opinion, or is it a news source that says so-and-so said this, and this is where they said it, and they have a direct quote? And also, do they quote just people who agree with one side, or do they quote a variety of people? Do they have do they have sources, kind of a gamut of sources? Is their primary purpose to report news in an impartial manner, or is their primary purpose to persuade you about something, or to reinforce what you already believe? So a lot of it's just judging what is the purpose of this, and does it and is it citing its footnotes, kind of thing would be how academia would put it. Are the sources attributed, and what information is provided to make me feel like I can believe that this is fact and not somebody's opinion.
I have noticed a lot of times, sometimes a good piece will it almost always has a contrarian point of view inserted in it to say there is another side to this, and here's a person holding that kind of position. Is that part of what you're trying to say? Is that a good piece will do that kind of work?
I think so. I think a good piece will try to reflect the full picture and reflect a variety of perspectives. There is a big debate in journalism now about what's called both sidesism, and it's kind of the idea that if one side obviously has the facts, then you don't necessarily have to quote somebody on the other side who's obviously wrong. And we could get into a whole other debate there, but I think in general what you're saying is, if there's a big debate over whether to require masks in my city, or whether to build a new water tower in my city, and there's people arguing on both sides of those issues. If the news story I read is just quoting people about how masks are a big invasion of my privacy, or if it's on the other side, just quoting, why masks are the only way to solve this problem, then maybe it's more of an opinion piece and more of somebody pushing an agenda, as opposed to whether if it's a story that says, this is what this group says, this is what this other group says, and this is what scientists say, this is what experts say, this is what the medical journals say, that if it's that there maybe you can tell if you take the time to actually click a link instead of debating 140 or 100 or 280 characters on Twitter, that you could maybe determine whether this is an article that's trying to give me all the facts to let me make an informed opinion on my own, or if it's just somebody trying to either give me one side of the story or trying to twist the story to get me to a certain position. I think that's what we're talking about.
Right. So an informed decision, that's an interesting and an important statement, it seems to me, Bobby, to have part of the thing we're looking for, or at least that's an assumption, right? That we are informed and that we draw our own conclusions. Which means that we've got to be working toward finding out, we need to be able to get to some facts, right? We need to be able to get to something that can kind of anchor opinions. Cheryl, what's happening in our world that seems to make that so hard?
Well, part of it is that everybody's out there with a Facebook page or a Twitter account or other platform presenting information. And unsophisticated readers don't really pay any attention to whether or not they are reading from a legitimate source or just from their neighbor's brother's son-in-law, who may or may not have any knowledge at all. And that's a part of it. There's just so much more information. And I remember 20 or so years ago when we were cautioned by people saying, the wonderful thing about social media is people are going to get to choose what information they want and have it channeled to them every day. And others were going, oh, that's not so good, because if you only choose the sources you're going to pay attention to, then you're going to find yourself in this echo chamber where you only hear what you want to hear from people who agree and think like you. And your perspective becomes not broader, but narrower. Mm-hmm. So one thing I always tell people is to read broadly. Mm-hmm. Don't just pay attention to one. Well, I also tell people to turn off cable news, but if you're going to watch cable news, then make yourself suffer through more than one cable news network.
Because when I think about that, I think we have many ministers on here now, and they would never think of preaching a text without reading a variety of commentaries on that text.
Exactly.
And they would particularly pay attention to those who take a point of view that is different from the one that they started out from. Those would be the more important sources than the ones that are just confirming their prejudices. And if we would be as conscientious towards the news as we are about our biblical preparation, we'd probably be better off.
And even in choosing those commentaries, you're going to be selective. You're going to not just choose 3 different ones because they happen to be different, but who is the best spokesperson for this viewpoint, and who is the best scholar on this viewpoint, and look at both of those, not just randomly pull something off the shelf so that you can say I had 3 sources.
Yeah, that's good. Well, that raises, Bobby, thinking about this, how would we become more literate as news readers, right? What might be some things we'd want to take into account to become persons who are exercise some reflection, to truly be informed? What does news literacy look like?
It's really simple to say, but it probably starts with actually reading some news. I mean, I'm amazed by how much of the debate and discussion that we have these days is, like Charles said, it's somebody watching and a person give their opinion on cable news, and that's how they base their view of the world, or they're arguing on social media based on the headline or the title without actually reading the news story. And the other thing I would recommend, and I know I'm sounding like a broken record back on this idea of a newspaper, but part of what happened when people did get a newspaper is you would come across information that would surprise you, or you wouldn't necessarily run into if you weren't turning the pages of a newspaper, because there would be things that it might be something that you and your friends was not on your radar, but this is something happening in the world that if you kind of force yourself to say, I'm going to take 10 minutes a day and read the news and try to be well informed outside of my group of Facebook friends or Twitter friends who all believe the same thing. And it doesn't have to be a print newspaper like Randy has. I've got the Oklahoman, the Washington Post, the Tennessean, the Houston Chronicle are papers that I can read on my iPad in this, in the printed form. I just scroll through it on my iPad, and it's just, and you don't have to do that. And it doesn't have to be a mainstream source. If you would rather have a Christian perspective, Christianity Today does great news coverage about things happening in the world. If Christianity Today is too progressive for your version of Christianity, World Magazine has a little more conservative perspective told from a Christian perspective. Obviously, Cheryl and I would urge everybody to read the Christian Chronicle, although it's a monthly publication and we're not out there every day. But there are just, if you make a concerted effort to kind of try to say, I'm going to expose myself to a wider view of information than maybe I'm doing right now, then maybe you will have a wider worldview and a wider understanding of things happening in the world.
Mhm.
Y'all are in the news business, and we probably have more viewers right now who are news junkies than we do people who aren't. But one of the questions that's come in does have to do with the fact that a lot of people just feel sidelined by events. They don't feel like they can be impactful actors. They don't believe that the people in the news have any interest in them. There's not anything they can do to impact it. And so the tendency is just to sort of drop out because it really doesn't have anything to do with me. What would you say to one of those people?
Well, it's true that we can't all have impact on everything. And that's one of the problems is there's so much information and there are so many sources that it can be overwhelming. So I think it's reasonable to choose the places and the people where you might hope to have some impact. Maybe that's something in your community. Maybe that's one particular issue that you spend more time learning about than others. I don't read so much financial news. I try to just enough to be aware, but I really don't think most of my decisions are going to have a big impact on the economy. I think other people's decisions are going to have a much bigger impact. But I pay a lot of attention to what happens to education in my local community because that affects people in the community. It affects my own kids who work in education. I spent my career in higher education. I spend a lot of time focused on that. My opinion might matter to someone there. And I think that's another thing is I don't expect anybody to ask me questions about high finance. I was a college professor and I don't know much about that. But they might care what I think about education. And so I want to be able to answer those questions. I think all of us have to recognize our limitations and our legitimate expertise.
And there's another question that as y'all were kind of reflecting on sources that's really asking the question of money. News is very big business, and there's some very big money that's invested in presenting the news in a certain sort of way. So maybe this goes back partly to the entertainment thing, where, but part of it has to do with just who's paying the piper here. What would you say about that?
Bobby, you want to?
Well, I think I'm surprised to hear that there's a lot of money in news. I haven't.
You
Can
mean
I
that
say one-
roll your way?
Can I say one quick thing about the previous question before I was, if we are talking about news junkies, I think, if you are someone who does already pay a lot of attention to the news and it's causing you to be depressed, or you're maybe give yourself permission not to spend so much time on the news, because I think there are some people that just live and die on everything out of Washington or every new headline, or we're living in a time with 500,000 people dead from COVID, and it could be a really depressing time, and we have to pay attention to the news, but I think we also have to give ourselves permission to live in our own neighborhood. And I was reading, the Texas power thing. There was a good story along the lines of, people who'd been so divided politically, maybe even neighbors with different signs, and suddenly they're having their neighbor come into their house and stay because they don't have any power. And maybe I think we're emphasizing you need to be news literate, but you also need to be willing to realize that if you live and die on every single headline, you're probably going to be miserable, because I've been in this for 30 years and the negative headlines don't seem to ever stop flowing. But anyway, that was a thought that came to mind on the previous question. And Randy, I forgot the current question. We're talking about
the economic, in what ways?
The economic model.
And the ways in which money or big money might be influencing what is in the news.
Well, and it's having a negative effect in a lot of cases, because hedge funds are buying up local newspapers and big giant companies. I think even the paper in Abilene is owned by a big company that owns a lot of papers all over. And I don't know of a lot of cases where that company has gone in and said, hey, we own your local newspaper now. Good news. We're going to hire more reporters and give you more news coverage. That is not what has happened. And there's hedge funds buying up papers, and a lot of newspapers that used to be family owned are suddenly owned by giant corporations, and reducing the number of reporters, and in some cases even reducing the coverage of the local community. So that's a negative. But on the other hand, my local newspaper, the Oklahoman, for $9.99 a month, I can read the entire print edition every day on my iPad for $10 a month, which is 2 cups of coffee. I got the Washington Post for $19.99 for 6 months to read anything on there. I think I pay $7 a month for the Tennessean. So if I may be misunderstanding the question, but for a news consumer perspective, it's not expensive to get news coverage.
No, I'm more concerned with where that news came from.
Okay.
And it may have come from somebody who has a very big financial interest in presenting that news in a certain way. And we're often not very aware that, what we thought was a simple fact was driven by some folks who have a very deep financial interest in presenting that in a certain way.
Randy, I think sometimes there are people who have a particular financial interest in presenting it a certain way. I think it's more common that they just have a financial interest in making money. And so, for example, I always tell people that who imagine that Fox News is the gold standard, the pure source of a conservative viewpoint, Fox News was created by Rupert Murdoch to make money off of a demographic he had not yet tapped. And if you imagine something different, then just look at all of the other entertainment and information outlets that Fox owns. There's nothing conservative about Fox Entertainment. Fox Sports is aimed largely at a male 18 to 34 demographic and hits some racial groups that it doesn't get from its other sources. Murdoch came to the United States to make money, and he's done it very, very well. But that's his primary goal. And the way that publications have always made money has been through the sale of advertising. And a lot of people don't really understand that. But, back in the old days, we used to say to students, your subscription doesn't even cover the cost of the paper and the ink, let alone the reporter's salary and the editor's salary and the photographer's salary. Advertising dollars pay for that. And the newspaper industry made some horrible mistakes about the financial model they would use online. And that's the subject for another day. But today, the digital model is based on clicks, but clicks tied to advertising. And so they want you to stay on their site as long as possible. They get you to do that by having headlines that cause you to click on those stories, because the longer you're there, the more time you also are exposed to certain advertisements, and the more likely you are to click on those ads. And that's how they make money. So yes, I think it's wise to be sensitive to any agendas that might be out there, but also to realize that the primary agenda is to generate a profit.
Yeah. Well, that to kind of press on beyond that, with that reality sort of on the table, one observation is that oftentimes news and opinion get intertwined, and a lot of the things that we may be reading, particularly if we're not reading primarily from the front and second pages of a newspaper, Bobby, as you were saying, is that we can quickly be reading opinion that's purporting itself to be news. Is that, am I right about that? Is that where a lot of this, a lot of disinformation begins to percolate, is what we might start moving into what we might call fake news? Bobby, you want to play with that for a little bit?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think one of the problems that the newspapers and news media in general have not done a great job of distinguishing online between what is supposed to be news and what is supposed to be opinions. I think maybe Cheryl brought this up earlier, but the newspaper, when you would get it on the print form, and even those few people that still get the print newspaper would have the front page is news, and then you get to an editorial page and it's opinion, because that's where they put opinion every day. And now you may not know. You may have to do a little analysis yourself to determine even if it's purporting to be a straight news story, if it's supposed to be a news analysis, which is kind of sort of news, but also the writer's analysis of that news, or if it's straight opinion. So it's harder to distinguish. Did I answer your question, or did I go right by it?
No, I think you're getting at it. And Cheryl, we were talking earlier, I don't want to attribute this, but how did you say this? Well, I can't get it there, but sometimes we're just lazy. I'll just say it, right?
Yes.
As readers,
Yes.
right? I mean, we're not doing the hard work that we need to do to truly, as a preacher, I would say exegete the text, to really exegete the news or the content of the media that I'm reading in such a way as to actually discern whether or not this is good, grounded, resourced material, or am I just reading somebody's opinion?
Yeah, exactly. I do think people tend to be very lazy consumers. They find a source that they like, and that's the one that they rely on, and that's it. And I would say, even though, and I think Bobby and I would both say that in what is unfortunately labeled negatively as mainstream news, that the Associated Press tends to be kind of the gold standard of reliability, maybe to the point of stodginess on occasion, but it's widely respected as being cautious and clear and down the line and very, very thorough. But if it's the only source you read, that's still lazy. And so, and I would say that's true, getting back to the news and opinion piece, that is true whether you're looking for information or whether you're looking for thoughtful opinion. If you only read conservative commentators, or if you only read liberal or progressive commentators, you're not getting a thoughtful, you're not able to form your own thoughtful opinion.
So I bring the eyes of a philosopher to the problem, and have spent most of my professional career trying to undermine the myth of objectivity. If a human being is doing the viewing and the reporting, it's going to be subjective. It's a human subject that's doing that. And so in that sense, they can't take their human subjectivity out of the reporting. It's going to be there. And that's back to, okay, they've got a lens, but they are looking at something. There's a something that they're looking at. And that's where you might want to have 2 or 3 different lenses. Exactly. Where you start to see that something
from different points of view, right?
Yeah. And and again, that's back to, that's a little more work. And maybe that's more work than we want to do. But Bobby, you were talking earlier, one of the questions sort of alludes to this. Big T truth, little t truth. Our Christian ministers do have some commitment to the notion of truth. Well, I didn't say that very well. They have more than some commitment to it. They have a high commitment to the truth of God as revealed in Jesus Christ. And that's an interesting position these days, where the whole category of truth is sort of under erasure. What would you, Cheryl, want to say about truth in a world of, what does Colbert call it, truthiness?
Well, I think if Christians are truly people of truth with a capital T, then they need to be just as concerned about truth with a capital, with a lowercase t, truth in the news. And there I don't want to get into specifics, but there were certain things, conspiracy theories, just claims that are made without any factual basis. And if Christians are willing to spread conspiracy theories and claims that have no factual basis about things happening in the world, why should people in the world trust those same Christians to be concerned about truth with a capital T, and not just saying whatever they want to say? I mean, I'm probably not making a lot of sense, but it seems like we have to have some concern about, if we believe in truth, we have to not be willing to believe or spread lies that have no factual basis, even if it's lies that we might like to be true or want to be true.
Yeah.
I have always said, and I used to warn students, that within the churches of Christ, and more broadly within, I think, more conservative religious fellowships, we are surrounded by a shoot the messenger denomination, a shoot the messenger group of believers who have a tendency to hear someone say something that they resent or disagree with or are saddened by, and their response is not to go out and try to solve the problem that's presented by that set of facts, but to blame the person that shared those facts with them. And so we see this, and we see this on social issues where people tend to see the little t and the big T as equivalent. and are absolutely unwilling to hear factual information from a person whose view of the subjects may not jive with theirs, whether it's related to abortion or issues tied to sexuality, whatever it is. There are truth tellers with solid facts all across the spectrum. And it gets back to that laziness issue, Randy. If we're going to figure out what's true, we have to be willing to hear those facts from lots of different people, because you know what? Sometimes the conservative and the liberal speaker shares the very same piece of information. Well, so let's not deny the piece of information. Let's figure out what to do with it, and through that, find the truth.
Good. That's good. Well, we need to turn to some questions that are coming in. And by the way, those of you who are participating with us today, please feel free to drop in a question to the Q&A slot here. But before we make that turn officially, though some of this is already getting into some of the questions that have been asked, I'm just kind of curious, what would you say to ministers? In what ways might ministers, since that's what most of our viewers are here, what would you say to them that might help? How might ministers foster better news literacy? Any thought or observation there, either by the way in which they, what they do in their public preaching, or most of us are on social media in some ways. I mean, where might ministers leverage their influence a bit to help promote literacy, news literacy? Cheryl, you got a thought there?
Well, first of all, I would say model it. In your own social media, you don't have to shy away from subjects that are sensitive or even controversial, but in the language you use and in the sources you use and in the way you talk to and interact with people, model the kind of behavior that Christians should model in all situations. You know, avoid hateful language and speech and name calling. And it's completely fine to say, I disagree with that. I think that you are wrong. It's something else entirely to say you're an idiot. And I see lots of Christians telling people that they're idiots and worse. So model appropriate behavior, and then model the use of a variety of sources. And I guess I would also say be courageous, because I don't envy you. I know you don't have tenure. I know that you walk into the pulpit and realize that in some cases saying the wrong thing, the wrong time, could be the last sermon you preach in that location. And so, you know, blessings on your head as you figure that out. But I would always say be courageous. You know, the prophets found themselves in trouble a lot too, but that doesn't mean they weren't doing the right thing.
I really wonder about that, Cheryl. I tend to tell ministers, I think you ought to get off social media. And I certainly don't think you should be talking about anything controversial or important, because that's non-relational speech. And you can't win. You can't win. And people are going to respond negatively no matter what you do on social media. Now you're part of this, and now you're part of this cycle. I'm just wondering out loud. I think in the pulpits you've got to address the world, but you at least have some sort of relationship with that group of people, and they've chosen to come. But push back.
I would argue that you can't address the world today if you are not paying attention to social media, and you can't pay attention to it if you aren't there. You know, I mean, I see people all the time say, I'm getting off Facebook. I just can't stand it anymore. You know, well, taking a break is wise, and we all have to know our own selves and our tolerance levels. But I do think that there is the potential for relationship building and communication in social media if it's used well. It's hard to do, but it just requires being thoughtful, being kind, being compassionate. And when I say be courageous, that has more to do with, I'm not wanting people to light fires, but trying to figure out which fires to put out. You know, sometimes you have to say, that's actually not true, you know, and be able to say that in a accurate but kind and forthright manner. And if ministers leave, then how can the people that they are speaking to every Sunday see them as models as how to interact in that marketplace? Because the marketplace, you know, is no longer just the folks spitting tobacco at the courthouse. You know, it's now the people who are showing up on Facebook to have a conversation.
Either way, we're dealing with significant issues, right?
Yeah.
Bob, I'd be curious what you might say to ministers as we think about modeling literacy, news literacy. Any thoughts that you might have?
Yeah, I think I would, you know, kind of as I think about what Randy said and what Cheryl said, I think that the ministers I appreciate on social media are the ones that can kind of play, they're not stoking fires, but they're also not avoiding, you know, important conversations that are out there, that if there is misinformation out there, that they're maybe calling it out. I'm thinking of one minister who on Facebook in the last couple of weeks, there was something that he felt was reflecting badly on Christians because Christians were sharing something that wasn't true. And he basically said, you know, we should be better about this as far as how we handle social media. But you know, Cheryl and I think tend to handle social media a little differently. Cheryl's pretty open about politics and how she feels about various politicians and various political issues. And I feel more like in my role that I don't need to be taking sides on controversial issues, which I know some of the comments are saying that's disengagement or avoidance, but I think, you know, as a journalist, I feel like I can maybe have a better conversation sometimes with people if I'm not like planting my feet on one side of an issue. And I think sometimes ministers do well to kind of be there and say, I'm here to lead people closer to Jesus, not closer to any political party, because I see, you know, there are some ministers I see on social media that I know exactly where they lean politically. I know exactly where they stand on issues and certain politicians. And I wonder if I'm in their pew on Sunday and I'm not with the particular candidate that they're pushing on social media all during the week, how I might feel about that in the pews. So I'm rambling, but my advice to ministers would just be try not to stoke the fires, try to leave social media better off than you found it, try to leave people with better information maybe than they had to start with. If it's a meme or some other misinformation or conspiracy theory that you can kindly say, I love you, brother, I love you, sister, but what you're saying here is not true. And I think our Christian witness that maybe we should have a little stronger information before we're putting that out there.
Yeah, that's good. It's good. Randy, were you about to? Nope. I saw you twitch. Okay.
I was twitching to read questions.
Oh, okay. I saw a move. I thought he's about to unmute and say something.
Well, it could be. I just twitched too.
I want to say this about Bobby's comment. I think, you know, Bobby and I reached this point in our lives and our professions from very differently. I've been an academic, you know, and academics are all about saying what's on their mind. Bobby's been a pure 100% journalist all these years. And so we kind of both bring that to this point where now he's still a full-time journalist. And I'm doing journalism, but I also have still got this academic piece of me, and I still, do some work with churches on other things. And I try to keep those hats sorted out, probably imperfectly. But I think when it comes down to what any Christian, in particular a minister, is going to say, you don't have to, just trying to find the right example is dangerous here. You don't have to take sides if you don't want to on the origins and values of the people who began the Black Lives Matter movement. But you have to be willing to say racism is wrong. And when you see racism, to speak out against that. You don't have to take sides on one politician's view of how to solve a particular economic problem, but you have to be willing to say, we're supposed to take care of the widow and the orphan because that's pure religion. And so I don't know how it's possible to preach and not wander into the things that are the social issues plaguing our society. And I don't know how you walk through social media without having those conversations. So
yeah, it brings us back to the Karl Barth analogy, right? With the newspaper in one hand, the Bible in the other, and living with the tension between those two spaces, it seems. And that's part of the challenge, isn't it? In some ways, one questioner is asking that part of the challenge may be even in deciding what is the facts, what is news itself. And we're coming near the end, but I do want to press on that question before we wrap up here. I'm just reading from this questioner. No matter where we get our news or consume our news, the tendency is if we don't like what we're reading, it's easy for us to call it fake. How might we bear truth when news, facts, or info are up for debate on what is true itself? This gets back to, how do we pursue that truth and stay attention to that when we're often debating about what is true? What would you say to that? That's a troubling reality. Surely, I'm not a historian of journalism, but it seems like that's probably always been contested in some way, but it seems particularly contested in our time and place. What would you say to that? Cheryl, I'll start with you and then maybe Bobby here.
Part of it is sorting out exactly what are the facts. So here, this analogy, I used to make students do a magazine level fact check about stories. And the first thing they had to do was to go through something that someone had written and take a red pen and circle every single thing that was a fact. So if they said that, the wind was a factor in the game, then they ought to find out if there was any wind that night. Okay, they need to find out. So was there a wind? Was it blowing 35 miles an hour? Did that matter? Oh, it was an indoor sport? No, the wind was not a factor. First of all, let's just, sort out what are facts and what are not. Because see, whether there was wind or not is a fact. Whether it affected play is an opinion. Does that make sense? That requires a pretty high level of analysis. It's not easy. And so we have to rely on some people to do some of that for us. And that's what journalists always have done. It was the job of the journalist to evaluate the quality of the source. And once upon a time, we more or less trusted them to do that. We've kind of quit trusting them. So I think journalists have an obligation to be as trustworthy as they can be while acknowledging that they have their own perspective. And all of us have to be willing to know that just like our medical doctor might know more than we do about some things, even within our own body, that the person who's trained for this job knows some things about evaluating sources and fact that we don't know.
Yeah, that's good.
Is that what you were trying
Yeah,
to?
I think you're helping us. That's important. Yeah, that's useful. That's useful. Bobby, anything you'd say to that? Business of pursuing truth, and how did we?
I just think we have to be open to facts. We live in a time where somebody can do a meme on Facebook, for example, and say, I don't know why we're getting all riled up about COVID-19. We have people die of the flu every year, and suddenly that's viral, and people are saying, yeah, I agree, we're overreacting. But a person interested in truth and facts would do some more research and find out 500,000 people have died, and that's more than more combined deaths in just in about a year than we have from, various other diseases combined, and that that the flu kills a certain number of people, but it's not anywhere near that. So I think the struggle that we have in this era is there's a certain group of people, including some of them who call themselves Christians, who are content to just take that meme that makes a claim that has no basis in fact and put it out there. Suddenly they and 2,000 of their friends have shared it on social media. We're all saying that, and suddenly we're all gonna, this isn't a big deal. I'm not gonna wear my mask anymore. You can't make me wear my mask. And I think what we're saying is actually take the time to educate yourself, figure out how many people have died of COVID, how bad this is, compare that to the actual numbers of other diseases, and then base your opinion on whether we're overreacting or not on the actual facts. And I think we're at an era in time where I think the word laziness may have been mentioned earlier, but people are just so lazy that they're willing to, somebody can say anything and, hey, that sounds good. I'll believe that. I'll share that on my Facebook page. And that's where I'm at now, without any basis in fact to back up something like that.
That's good. Yeah. Hey, we're coming to the end of our hour. I want to ask each of you, Randy, Cheryl, and Bobby, what would be your last word today? We've been trying to unpack the craziness of this time and space where we really struggle with paying attention to news and to media. We've covered a lot of ground. There's a lot of ground we could have easily covered here, but how would you close? What would be the last thing you'd want to offer? Cheryl, I'll start with you, and then Randy, and then Bobby. Cheryl, what would you say as we wrap up here today?
Read broadly, value truth, be compassionate when you share it, but be courageous when you share it. That's probably as best I can do.
Those are great attributes or claims for us to live into. Randy, what would you say as we wrap up?
Two things. One is very brief, and that is pay attention to local news.
Yes.
You get caught up in Washington, but there's stuff that's happening in your town that needs a response. The second thing is, to the ministers, you've made a commitment to read the news through a certain lens, and that's the lens of a crucified and risen Messiah. And your task every time you get up is to interpret the world through that lens. And when that doesn't happen, you haven't done your job. And you're being very overt about what that lens is. And I've often thought, if I were going to preach every week at a church right now, I would preach for the next year on the gospel and I would fill in the and with something that was going on in the world and make sure that, whether people agree or disagree, that we're reading that through the lens of Jesus Christ, because as a minister, that's what you committed yourself to do. And it's easy to get caught up in all sorts of other lenses. And when you do that, it's not preaching anymore. It's only preaching when it's done through that lens. I'd call for a recommitment that we're going to interpret the world. We're going to interpret the news through our understanding of the gospel.
Love it. Thanks, Randy. Bobby, what would you say as we wrap up here today?
I would just echo what Cheryl said about read broadly, echo what Randy said about reading your local news. And a big part of that would be putting a little skin in the game in terms of if you can afford $15 or $20 a month or whatever it is to subscribe to your local publication. Local newspapers are dying all over the country, and part of the reason we're in the circumstance we're in now as far as the lack of trust in news is because we're getting all of our news from people in places that aren't the place where we live. I mean, I know there's corporate ownership and you get some of that even in your local community, but if everybody who was watching this and all of their friends were suddenly to buy a subscription to their local newspaper, I think our world would be better informed and we would have better news and more. We wouldn't have to be having some of the parts of this conversation that we've just had.
I appreciate that, Bobby. I often think that we spend way too much time worrying about Washington when we need to be worrying about our own main streets and where we live and where we actually might know our neighbors and can practice the kind of care and compassion that goes along with our Christian faith. Hey, I want to say thank you to Cheryl, to Bobby for being with us today. Randy and I delight in these conversations each week. This has been rich and full. So I thank you. I want to say thank you to all of you who've tuned in today, or participants, your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to everything today. Your comments as we've chatted together in this hour. Thank you. I want to say thank you to Renee Paul and our team at the Siburt Institute for their logistical support today. Our next intersection is coming up in March. It's March the 16th. We'll be talking about prayer and the practice of prayer. Our special guest that day will be Dr. Houston Heflin. Houston's got a fairly new book out on the practice of prayer, and we're going to have him on. We're going to explore the ways in which prayer can enliven and anchor our lives. So I think that wraps up the things I need to say. I want to again thank everyone for being a part of this. And Randy, I'm going to ask you to offer a benediction, a good word as we close today.
The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and give you peace. To him who is able to keep you from falling and to present you before his glorious presence without fault and with great joy. To the only God, our Savior, be glory and majesty, dominion and power through Jesus Christ our Lord, before all ages, now and forevermore, world without end. Amen.